June 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. The humid Pacific air shimmered with heat as Japanese naval aviators lounged beneath a corrugated metal awning at WWII Airfield. Cigarette smoke curled lazily upward while mechanics worked in the background, their hands stained with oil, their engines humming with life. The Mitsubishi A6M0, sleek, elegant, the pride of the Imperial Navy, glistened beneath the morning sun. Lieutenant Saburo Sato, a veteran of China and the Solomons, smirked as a courier handed him a crumpled intelligence sheet. "New American fighters sighted over Guadalcanal," it read in uneven translation. The type, Grumman F6F Hellcat. He chuckled. "Grumman?" he said, glancing at his wingman. "They built the tub, the Wildcat. Slow, clumsy. If this Hellcat is its brother, it'll die the same way." Laughter rippled through the group. For years, the Zero had ruled the Pacific skies with terrifying grace. It could outclimb, outturn, and outrange anything the Allies had. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, its legend had spread like wildfire. Allied pilots whispered its name in fear, calling it the Dragon. But that dominance had come at a cost, arrogance. And in 1943, somewhere over Long Island, New York, a new beast was stirring in the hangars of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. Its creator, Leroy Grumman, was not a man of theater, but of function. He had studied the war from afar, the reports of burned-out Wildcats, the desperate dispatches from Midway, the thin balance of steel and survival. The Americans didn't need a faster Wildcat. They needed an entirely new predator. The first Hellcat prototype, the XF6F1, rolled onto the runway at Bethpage in June 1942. Test pilot Robert Hall climbed into the cockpit, his flight suit crisp, his gloves oiled. The aircraft gleamed under the summer sun, its wings broad and thick, its fuselage powerful but plain. It was heavier than the Wildcat by 2 tons, its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a monstrous 2,000 horsepower radial that could outmuscle any Zero at altitude. When Hall throttled forward, the tarmac shuddered. The plane leapt down the runway and clawed into the sky with a sound unlike anything before. A deep, steady roar, not the high-pitched whine of Japanese engines. "Feels like a bull," he said over the radio, "but a bull that listens." Grumman's engineers gathered around the telemetry boards, watching the data. They weren't chasing elegance. They were building survivability. The lessons of the Wildcat had been brutal. Too slow to climb, too stiff to turn, and too fragile against the Zero's cannons. But it had one virtue. It could take damage and still bring its pilot home. The Hellcat would build on that. Thicker-skinned, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate behind the seat, bulletproof glass in the canopy. It would not dance. It would brawl. By August 1942, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had placed its order before the first prototype had even finished testing. The Pacific was burning, and the fleet needed a fighter that could claw back the skies. One engineer, years later, described the moment simply, "We built it fast because our boys were dying faster." The first production, F6F3 Hellcats, began rolling off the line in early 1943. Olive-drab beasts of steel and sinew. They were ugly, heavy, and to some, uninspiring. Pilots called it the aluminum tank. But when the first squadrons trained at NAS Norfolk, something became clear. This plane didn't demand perfection. It forgave mistakes. It could dive without tearing itself apart, climb without overheating, and still outgun the enemy with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of spitting 750 rounds per minute. In mock dogfights against captured Zeros and British Spitfires, the Hellcat didn't always turn tighter. But it always came home. That spring, The pilots of VF-9 and VF-5 prepared for deployment aboard the USS Essex and Yorktown. The Pacific awaited. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to change the air war forever. As the first F6Fs were hoisted aboard carriers in the spring of 1943, word began to spread among the Japanese scouts. New American fighter, large, dark, fast. The same pilots who had laughed at its name would soon learn what it meant to meet a Hellcat in combat. The laughter would not last long. September 13th, 1943. Over Marcus Island. The Pacific sky was a blinding white canvas, streaked with sunlight and contrails. From the deck of the carrier USS Essex, the first squadron of F6F Hellcats thundered into the air. The beginning of a new kind of air war. Lieutenant J.G. Hamilton McWhorter gripped the control stick tightly as the catapult hurled his aircraft off the deck. The Pratt & Whitney roared beneath him, a wall of power vibrating through the seat. He leveled off at 10,000 feet, the deep blue wings gleaming with salt spray. "Hellcats, form up!" came the voice of Commander Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace, now leading the carrier's fighter group. Below them, the sea flashed like glass. Ahead beyond the horizon lay Marcus Island, a small fortified atoll in the mid-Pacific, one of Japan's forward outposts. The Americans were coming to strike it, and the Hellcat was about to draw blood for the first time. As the formation climbed higher, the radio crackled again. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Looks like zeros." McWhorter squinted into the sunlight. Small black dots grew larger by the second. Graceful, lethal, the same aircraft that had once humiliated the Allies from Pearl Harbor to Wake Island. The Zeros approached in a V formation, sunlight flashing off their rounded wingtips. For months, Japanese pilots had boasted that the Americans could not build a fighter to rival theirs. The Hellcat, they said, was just another overweight machine for clumsy Westerners. Too slow to maneuver, too heavy to win. But this time, they were wrong. The first passes were furious. McWhorter dived hard, his 6.50 calibers blazing. Tracers tore through the air, stitching across the leading Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese plane burst into flame instantly, shearing left before plunging into the sea. McWhorter felt the recoil hammer through his arms. He pulled up sharply, the Hellcat responding like an extension of his own will. Smooth, stable, powerful. "One down," he muttered. Another Zero flashed past his canopy. McWhorter rolled, dropped flaps, and turned into the attack. The Hellcat didn't turn as tightly as the Zero, but it didn't need to. The American pilot could use energy instead of agility. He climbed, rolled over, and came down like a falling hammer. 2-second burst, the second Zero disintegrated. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time the smoke cleared, the Americans had downed 10 enemy aircraft for the loss of one Hellcat. The victory was decisive, not because of numbers, but because of what it revealed. The Hellcat could not only fight the Zero, it could dominate it. When the squadron landed back aboard the Essex, O'Hare gathered his pilots on deck, the smell of cordite still in the air. He tapped the side of a Hellcat's fuselage and said, "Boys, this one's a keeper." In Tokyo, the reports from Marcus Island painted a grim picture. "New American fighter, heavy but deadly," read the summary. Japanese analysts noted the thicker armor, the powerful engine, the unmatched firepower. Yet, even then, some commanders dismissed it as an isolated success. They didn't understand yet that the age of the Zero was ending. Over the next 6 months, the Hellcat spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Every new carrier group received them: Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Lexington. Mechanics learned to patch them in hours. Pilots learned to trust them with their lives. The Japanese began calling it the Grumman Cat. They meant it as an insult at first, a brute a beast. But before long, it became something else, a name spoken with quiet dread. By early 1944, the Hellcat's legend was spreading. Pilots who had once feared the Zero now spoke of hunting them. The squadron insignias began to show cartoon cats swatting away Japanese planes like toys. But the real test was still to come. A battle so vast that it would decide the fate of air power in the Pacific. In the summer of 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat would meet the full strength of Japan's air fleet and prove, once and for all, who ruled the sky. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea. Dawn broke in a pale haze, washing the decks of Task Force 58 in silver light. Across hundreds of miles of open ocean, the U.S. Navy's carrier fleet stretched in silent formation. Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, and more. Their decks bristling with blue-painted Hellcats lined wingtip to wingtip. Mechanics moved among them like ants, fueling tanks, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition, and checking control cables. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of aviation fuel. Pilots stood on the deck in groups, some joking, others silent, each aware that by nightfall, the fate of the Pacific Air War could be decided. The Japanese combined fleet, still confident, still dangerous, was coming. Radio intercepts and submarine sightings had confirmed it. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force was advancing from the west, carrying nearly 450 aircraft. Their goal: annihilate the U.S. fleet protecting the Marianas Islands and halt the American drive toward Japan. At 9:30, radar operators aboard the carrier USS Lexington picked up the first blips. A massive wave of incoming aircraft, high and fast, 70 miles out. The alarm sounded. "All pilots to your planes!" Engines roared to life. Hellcats rolled forward, wings locking into place as flight directors waved their paddles. The first wave lifted off into the humid sky, their propellers carving silver halos in the mist. Above the Pacific, the battle began. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu of VF-16 scanned the horizon from his Hellcat's cockpit, sunlight glinting off the canopy glass. Below him, the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly, beautiful, silent, and deadly. Then he saw them. Dots against the eastern sky, dozens of them, glinting like metallic insects. Japanese A6M0s, D4Y Judies, and B6N Jills. The finest the Imperial Navy could muster. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Angels 18, he called over the radio. The Hellcats tightened formation. The Japanese came on fast, sunlight flashing off their wings. To many of them, this was a final chance. To strike a blow worthy of their fallen comrades. To prove that the Zero still ruled the Pacific. They never made it. Vratsiu rolled hard right and dove straight into the swarm. The 6 Brownings in his wings erupted, streams of tracers tearing across the sky. The first bomber caught fire instantly, spiraling into the sea below. Another came up behind him. He felt the rattle of bullets peppering his tail, but held steady, pulling up sharply. The Zero overshot, and Vratsiu cut it in half with a single burst. For 90 minutes, the sky over the Philippine Sea became a slaughterhouse. Japanese pilots, many green recruits with only a few dozen hours of training, charged headlong into disciplined American squadrons, flying machines that outperformed theirs in every way. The Hellcats dove faster, climbed higher, absorbed hits, and hit back harder. A radio operator aboard Lexington described what he saw through binoculars. "They came in like a swarm of bees, and we just swatted them out of the sky." By noon, the first wave was annihilated. When the second wave arrived that afternoon, the result was the same. Entire squadrons of Japanese aircraft were wiped out before reaching bombing range. The Hellcats shredded them in midair, the ocean below dotted with burning wrecks and oil slicks. By evening, the American pilots were exhausted, their hands trembling, their guns nearly empty. Yet, their losses were astonishingly light. That day, June 19, 1944, would be remembered forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost fewer than 30 planes. The Hellcat had fulfilled its destiny. It wasn't the fastest fighter of the war, nor the most graceful, but it had been designed for one purpose: to win. As Admiral Mark Mitcher surveyed the reports that evening aboard the USS Lexington, he turned to his staff and said quietly, "They came in laughing, and they died still believing they could win." The Japanese air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was shattered, and from that moment on, the blue-painted wings of the Hellcat ruled the skies unchallenged. October 1944, Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The largest naval battle in human history was unfolding across hundreds of miles of ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled everything: carriers, battleships, and what remained of its air arm, in a desperate attempt to crush the American invasion of the Philippines. But above the thunder of guns and the roar of the sea, another battle raged, one that would confirm the Hellcat's absolute mastery of the skies. From the deck of the USS Enterprise, waves of F6F Hellcats launched in perfect rhythm. The deck crews worked wordlessly, drenched in sweat and jet blast, guiding the heavy blue fighters down the catapults. The smell of oil, cordite, and salt hung thick in the humid morning air. "Hellcat 1-1, airborne," came the radio call as Lieutenant Cecil Harris pulled back on his stick, the powerful Pratt & Whitney engine dragging him upward through the haze. The airspace above Leyte was chaos. Pillars of smoke from burning ships, flak bursts like black flowers blooming across the clouds, and faint glints of metal as Japanese planes dove from the sun. "Eyes sharp," Harris said to his wingman. "They'll come in fast and low." He was right. Moments later, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared. Sleek Nakajima B-6N JIL torpedo bombers, escorted by A-6M50's flying cover. They came straight for the American fleet, formation tight, courage unwavering. But they never reached their targets. The Hellcats fell on them like wolves. Harris throttled forward, lining up his gun sight on the lead JIL. 6 Brownings thundered at once, the tracers carving a glowing path through the bomber's wing. The enemy aircraft disintegrated in a spray of fuel and fire. His wingman, Ensign Dave Rowland, caught another in a climbing burst, its torpedo tumbling uselessly into the sea as the plane exploded. Over the radio, pilots shouted, "Splash 1! Splash 2!" The tone was calm, efficient. Not arrogance, but precision. Below, the Navy's radar operators tracked the engagement. One report read simply, "Fighter Cap destroyed 30 enemy aircraft in 15 minutes. By the second day of the battle, over 400 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, the majority by Hellcats. For the Imperial Navy, it was the end of air power. Their veteran pilots were gone, their replacements barely trained. Their aircraft, once symbols of dominance, had become obsolete against an enemy that could outclimb, outgun, and outlast them. The Americans now owned the skies. Aboard the Enterprise, a group of mechanics gathered on deck after the last sortie, wiping sweat and grease from their faces. A Hellcat came in for landing, its paint scorched, holes riddling the wings. But it was still flying. One crewman patted the fuselage as it rolled past. "Tough old cat," he said, and that toughness became legend. Stories spread across the fleet, of Hellcats limping home with half their wings shredded, of engines running on 3 cylinders, of pilots who bailed out only because their guns had run dry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. It was the kind of plane that made heroes of ordinary men. By the end of 1944, the numbers told a story all their own. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed over 4,900 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. Its kill ratio, 19-1. Even the Japanese acknowledged its dominance. In post-war interviews, surviving pilots spoke of it with grim respect. The Zero could turn, one said, but the Hellcat could fight. It had armor, power, and a pilot who could survive to fly again. That was the difference. The Americans could replace their planes and their pilots faster than Japan could bury hers. The Hellcat wasn't just a weapon. It was an industrial miracle, the embodiment of a war machine that could outproduce and outlast anything its enemy built. From the Marianas to the Philippines, from the Coral Sea to Okinawa, the blue-winged Hellcats became a symbol of inevitable victory, the roar in the sky that signaled the end of Japan's empire. As one Navy historian later wrote, the Hellcat did not just win the Pacific, it avenged Pearl Harbor. But for the men who flew it, victory was personal, hard-earned and soaked in sweat and blood. And for the enemy who once laughed at its name, the lesson was cruel and final. The Hellcat was not a joke. It was the last thing they ever saw. August 1945. Guam. The war was almost over. The Pacific, once roaring with fire and steel, now lay quiet beneath a gray sky. Rows of Hellcats sat neatly on coral airstrips, their blue paint dulled by salt and sunlight. The names of distant victories stenciled beneath their cockpits: Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The smell of oil still lingered, but the sound of engines was fading. Pilots wandered between their aircraft, talking in low voices, smoking cigarettes, or just staring out toward the ocean. They had fought, survived, and now waited, uncertain what peace would even mean. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter, now an ace with 12 confirmed kills, leaned against the wing of his F6F5. He had flown over 200 missions since that first combat over Marcus Island. His once fresh flight jacket was frayed and sun-bleached, the leather soft with wear. In his hand was a letter from home, his mother's handwriting, careful and trembling. "Come home safe," it read. He smiled faintly, folded it back into his pocket, and watched the sun dip behind the jungle. A few yards away, ground crews were servicing the last Hellcats to fly. They still checked the oil, still loaded ammunition, habits too hard to break. The war's end was official, but for the men who had lived by the rhythm of sorties and dogfights, the silence was almost unbearable. That night, the pilots gathered in the ready room. Someone put a record on the turntable, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The soft brass melody filled the room, a haunting reminder of the world they'd left behind. No speeches were made, no toasts, just the quiet acknowledgement between men who had survived the impossible. Aboard carriers across the Pacific, the numbers were being tallied. By the war's end, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built, more than any other naval fighter in history. Together, they had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. The Japanese Zero, the once mythic symbol of dominance, had been humbled beyond recovery. The Hellcat had outlasted it, outperformed it, and, in many ways, buried it. But the men who flew the Hellcat never bragged. They knew the truth. The Zero had been designed for a different kind of war, one fought by elite pilots in hand-built machines. The Hellcat belonged to the modern era, mass-produced, rugged, and built for survival. It was a machine of democracy, as one pilot called it. Anyone could fly it. Everyone could win in it. When the Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, hundreds of Hellcats roared over Tokyo Bay as the surrender papers were signed aboard the USS Missouri. The sound was deafening, a symphony of vengeance and victory. Below, sailors looked up, shading their eyes as the planes passed overhead in tight formation. For a moment, the war's entire story was written in that sky. From the smoldering decks of Pearl Harbor to the burning carriers of Leyte. From the first laugh of the Zero pilots to their final silence. Weeks later, the Hellcats began to return home. Some were mothballed in desert storage. Others were sold for scrap, their metal melted down to feed the post-war boom. But a few survived. In museums, in hangars, in the hearts of those who had flown them. When asked years later what it felt like to fly the Hellcat, one veteran said quietly, "It was like shaking hands with victory. You knew the moment you took off that you'd come back." And maybe that was the Hellcat's true legacy. Not just a machine of war, but a promise of survival. It didn't rely on elegance or grace. It relied on strength, endurance, and the spirit of the men who flew it. For those who once laughed at it, the ones who saw its heavy frame and slow climb and called it a brute, the laughter had long since faded into the Pacific winds. Because in the end, the Hellcat didn't just win battles. It won the air itself. And as the world turned from war to peace, its echo, the growl of that great engine over endless blue, lingered like a heartbeat across history.